This is the General's water here. Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the 153rd Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures always has been and always will be to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased, no, we are indeed honored, to welcome today General David Petraeus to the Landon podium to join 152 predecessors in bringing, in this case, his thoughts and opinions on important public issues. Before introducing members of the platform party, I would like to introduce some special guests in the audience. Now keep in mind, this is not complete. You'll always miss somebody. But certainly it is my high honor to introduce retired General Richard Myers, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and currently serving as the Foundation Professor of Military History and Leadership at Kansas State University. A few years ago, we dedicated our military science building to him in honor of his rising from a lonely ROTC cadet at Kansas State to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Myers, where are you? We're happy to have retired General Richard Sykes, a highly decorated veteran of the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam. General Sykes, please. Thank you. From the 1st Infantry Division, Fort Riley, the Division Command Sergeant Major, the people who run the U.S. Army, in his particular name, Jim Champagne. Jim? Please. There he is. We're very pleased to have a Kansan, Major General Todd Bunting, Adjutant General for the state of Kansas. There he is. Then we have a dear friend, I've known him for a long time, retired Brigadier General Chris King. He serves as the Dean of Academics at the Command in General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, with which I think many of you know, Kansas State University has had a long, long academic relationship. We are currently teaching a master's and PhD in security studies and a master's in EDD in adult education at Fort Leavenworth. And by the way, plumb full, great programs, right, Chris? So, Chris King. Well, we're honored to have two members of the Kansas Board of Regents. As you know, K-State, like the other institutions, is governed by the Kansas Board of Regents. So two of our regents are here this afternoon. Regent Jerry Betker. Jerry, thank you very much. And Regent Dick Hedges. Dick, thank you for coming. And then let me introduce our local legislators. State Representative Roger Wrights. Roger? There he is. State Representative Tom Hawk. Also in our audience is the President of the Kansas Senate, Steve Morris. Steve, thank you for coming. And then the Secretary of State, Ron Thornburg. Ron, there he is. And then, of course, we have many other state legislators here, and I wish I could introduce you all, but there are too many. And I thank you, one and all, state legislators from the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle, for coming here today. And we're honored to have our provost, who's the new president of the University of Idaho, Dwayne Ellis. Dwayne, thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a number of soldiers here who have recently served in Iraq and or Afghanistan, or both. Today we have the opportunity to welcome more than 1,000 soldiers and their dependents who are with us today from Fort Riley. Thank you for everything you do for the United States of America. Thank you, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot thank those men and women enough for their sacrifices and their duty and commitment to honor and integrity. I did introduce State Representative Sidney Carlin. Sorry about that, Sidney. Well, now I would like to introduce members of the Platform Party. On my left, or your right, Professor Fred Fairchild, who, believe me, has been a magnificent faculty senate president. He's a professor in grain science and industry, president of the faculty senate, my dear friend, Fred Fairchild. And that's next to him, our new student body president, a senior in ag communications and agricultural economics, and our president of the Kansas State University student body, Dalton Henry. And then next to him, actually over here on my right, Ed Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury, a dear friend. I'll tell you what, the Manhattan Mercury is one of the best small-town papers in the United States of America. Thank you, Ed. God bless you. And next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, Associate of the President and Chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. And let me mention this. Dr. Reagan has served as Chairman of the Landon Lecture for 25 years. This is his 89th Landon Lecture. Prior to 1986, and at the start of our administration in July of 1986, there were 72 Landon Lectures. Chuck has been just a brilliant advisor to me. He was my first hire. He's just done a superb job on a variety of fronts, but certainly commanding this Landon Lecture series. Let's give Chuck Reagan a real big hand. Thank you very much. And then I have to tell you, I am no spring chicken myself. So I've been here 23 years. And I have presided over 81 Landon Lectures, which is well over half of all of the Landon Lectures since 1986. And I'm happy to tell you, this is my last one. No, I mean, 23 years is enough. It is time to move on. And Ruth Ann and I and our kids are looking forward to moving on. It has been a thrill and a privilege and an honor to represent Kansas State University for 23 years. So this is my last Landon introduction as President of Kansas State. So I bid you all farewell. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think you all know over the last 2 or 3 years we've had just an incredible list of speakers, including President George Bush, President Bill Clinton, former President of the Soviet Union Mikhail Gorbachev, the former President of Poland Lech Wałęsa, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, like the day after, Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, who outlined some very new theories here, and just a host of wonderful men and women over 23 years that has been such a pleasure to introduce. But this certainly has to be a fitting climax to my 23 years of introducing 81 Landon Lectures, because he is a hero in the United States of America. I got to know him when he was at Fort Leavenworth and the commanding general over there. And he was over here 3 or 4 times. But for me to have this opportunity to introduce General David H. Petraeus, who is now the commander of the U.S. Central Command. Think about that. Right now, today, he is the commander of the U.S. Central Command in one of the most important epochs in the history of America. He assumed this position in October of 2008 after serving for 19 months as the commanding general multinational force in Iraq. General Petraeus, let me remind you about this, was the commander of what is now known as the Surge, which has been very successful in pacifying Iraq and allowing a civilian government to take over complete control of the country. And just for that alone, let's give them a big hand, just for that alone. You talk about doing the impossible and fulfilling the American dream and doing what so many experts said was well nigh impossible. Well, we know in America, don't we, that one person can make a difference. And our general has done exactly that. General Petraeus has had a long and distinguished and a brilliant military career. After his graduation from the U.S. Military Academy in 1974, he commanded a company in the 24th Infantry Division. In the Army, you have to work your way up. You aren't just appointed a commanding general. Isn't that right, Dick Myers? Or Richard Seitz? You got to work your way up. And a battalion in the 101st Airborne Division, a brigade in the 82nd Airborne Division, and he commanded the 101st Airborne Division, leading that unit in combat throughout the first year of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And you know what a tough year that was. General Petraeus has had many other top-level positions in the United States military. And as you can see, he has an incredible number of awards for valor, service, and accomplishments. He is a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Chris, I would say he's probably one of your better graduates.
Get it right, Chris.
Well, and listen to this now, for the academics out there, he holds a master's and a PhD in international relations from Princeton University. We are pleased at Kansas State University when General Petraeus was the commander of the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth. It was under his command that our academic programs that I just told you about began to flourish at Fort Leavenworth. And they are just going to get bigger and better. So, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, please help me introduce one of America's greatest military heroes in our entire history, the commander of the U.S. Central Command, General David Petraeus.
Well, good afternoon. Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thanks very much, President Weefald, for the invitation to speak here today and for those very kind words. You know, that's one of those introductions when you wish your parents could have been here. You know, my father would have enjoyed your kind words, and my mother would have believed every one of them. But it's great to be back at K-State in the heart of Wildcat Nation once again, and it's wonderful to see all these folks in uniform out here. I hope you can still say "hua" out here. Hua! See that? We didn't even rehearse it. I mean, that was awesome. Not bad. Thanks again, though, Mr. President. And please allow me, if I could, to turn the spotlight back on you for a moment and to congratulate you, as you all heard, on 23 years of awesome service to K-State and on the numerous impressive accomplishments here during your time. By all accounts, you have been the central element in significant academic, athletic, and financial growth for the university during your time at the helm, and I consider it an honor to be the speaker at this, your last of 81 Landon Lectures. Well done, Mr. President. Thank you. Great to have so many Kansas leaders here today as well. The Secretary of State, as you heard, the President of the Kansas Senate, many members of the legislature, a number of military leaders here today, as we heard, retired General Dick Myers, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and of course an alumnus of this great university. And I was there the day that they dedicated the ROTC building to him, and it was a great moment for this great university and certainly for a great military leader. The AG of the great Sunflower State, Major General Todd Bunting, great to see you again. Brigadier General Chris King, the Dean of the mighty Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, please give him my best to all the folks at our Army's foremost center of intellectual critical mass. But I just hope the pull-up bars still have fresh tape on them and that you still conduct the Iron Major competition twice a year. I want to give a special shout-out to those 1,000 or more troopers who have joined us from Fort Riley, as well as to the 200 or so ROTC cadets in the audience. In fact, I would actually like to ask all who are serving or have served our country in uniform if you'd stand up so that we can recognize you as well. Go ahead, please stand up. Hua. And I do want to add special recognition to that of President Weefald for one of our country's true national assets for many years, and that is Lieutenant General Dick Seitz, a true legend in our Army's airborne community, one of the Big Red One's greatest champions, and an absolute American hero. His accomplishments could and do, in fact, fill history books. A graduate of Leavenworth High School in 1937, and then attended this great institution where he did 2 years and then decided it was time to get into uniform. He rose from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel from 1939 to the mid-1940s. Those are some pretty fast promotions there, General Seitz. Perhaps you could give us a few pointers. And he commanded one of the lead battalions that parachuted into southern France during the operation called Dragoon in World War II. Later commanded the Airborne School, served as the Chief of Staff for our military headquarters in Vietnam for 2 years, after which he commanded the great 82nd Airborne Division and the equally great 18th Airborne Corps. Thanks for all you have done for our country over the years again, General Seitz. Again, it's really good to be back at K-State, to be in Manhappening, I think you call it, the Little Apple. Luckily, we had a police escort to get through traffic on the way over here. Midtown traffic. Well, they tell me Midtown here can be tough at this time of day. And it has been a while since my visits here for Secretary Rumsfeld's Landon Lecture, for the dedication of the ROTC building and all the rest. And it's great to see that the infantry sunshine that was falling outside couldn't keep you all away. You got to have that stuff in the spring. You know, you got to keep the sunflowers hydrated. I must say that you do a wonderful job of transforming this great basketball stadium into a superb lecture hall. It looks like everybody's here but Willie the Wildcat, and he may be here too, who knows. I won't promise that my remarks will be nearly as entertaining as a Wildcat basketball game, but I do hope to provide a few insights this afternoon on some of the operations we're overseeing at Central Command. I'm very aware that the Landon Lecture, as the President mentioned, is a platform typically reserved for U.S. and foreign leaders and diplomats, so I feel very honored to have the opportunity to speak here this afternoon. Before I begin, though, I have to note that seeing so many young leaders in uniform in the audience takes me back to my own days, early days in the Army, right after finishing my own undergraduate experience at West Point. I was a brand new lieutenant out on my first field exercise with my platoon. We'd had a long day, and we didn't crawl into our sleeping bags until shortly before midnight. I'd only been asleep for an hour or so when my platoon sergeant, a wise old airborne veteran who probably served with General Sights, elbowed me and woke me up. "Sir," he said, "look up. Tell me what you see." So I looked up at a beautiful night sky and replied, "I see 1,000,000 stars, platoon sergeant." "And what does that tell you, sir?" my wise old platoon sergeant asked. Well, not exactly sure what he was getting at, I thought for a few moments, and wanting to impress him, I gave an answer that I thought he would conclude to be truly profound and indicative of a keen intellect. "Well, platoon sergeant," I said, "astronomically it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Theologically, it tells me that God is great and that we are but small and insignificant. Meteorologically, it tells me that we're going to enjoy a beautiful day for training tomorrow." There was a long pause as my platoon sergeant considered this weighty answer. Thinking that he might be speechless after such an impressive response, I waited a moment and finally asked him, "Well, what does it tell you, platoon sergeant?" "Well, sir," he replied, "it tells me that somebody stole our tent." Well, that was a few years ago, and thankfully I've had a little seasoning since then, so please rest assured I won't try to be profound today. What I will do is discuss two of the biggest challenges in the Central Command area of responsibility, Iraq and Afghanistan. After first providing a brief update on the situation in Iraq, I'd like to discuss the so-called surge and the accompanying concepts that helped create such significant progress there, operations in which many in this audience performed so magnificently. And it is very good to see individuals like Colonel Rick Gibbs, Colonel Pat Franks, Sergeant Major Jim Champagne, Sergeant Isaac Heyman of the Great Black Lions of the 1st of the 28th. Are they here by any chance? See that, by golly? And they were magnificent. And we'll see you after this, Sergeant. You here, right? See that? Okay, stand up. Where is Sergeant Heyman? For any of your sports teams, by the way, Mr. President, if they ever want to get a truly great workout, go do PT with the Black Lions. I'm not joking. I've done it. And it was great and memorable. But it is wonderful, again, to have such individuals in the audience today and to be able to think back on what they accomplished. Now, after that, I'm going to give an update on the situation in Afghanistan, highlighting the ways we're seeking to apply lessons learned in Iraq to the effort there, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. First, as I said, the situation in Iraq. Quite simply, it has improved substantially, though as we see periodically and as we saw last week, significant challenges do remain. Nonetheless, levels of violence have been reduced very significantly to those not seen since mid-2003, before the insurgent and militia problems grew to produce the horrific sectarian violence of 2006 and the first half of 2007. Some in the audience will remember, in fact, June 2007, when there was an average of 160 attacks in Iraq per day. By contrast, in the past 4 to 5 months, the average has been between 10 and 15 attacks per day, and that is, again, in no small measure due to the efforts of some of those in this audience, those they represent throughout our military, and their Iraqi partners. Beyond the improvements in the security situation, the Iraqis in January conducted provincial elections, which were certified by the UN to have been free and fair, which resulted in more representative councils than was previously the case, and which generally reflected a rejection of the political parties most under the influence of Iran. More recently, the Council of Representatives elected a new speaker, and provincial councils have been seated. And although al-Qaeda in Iraq does remain a force capable of periodic sensational attacks, Iraqi and coalition forces have dealt it significant blows in the course of the past 2 years, reducing its capabilities considerably. Moreover, increasingly capable and trusted Iraqi security forces have taken on an expanded role, allowing all this progress to occur even as we have withdrawn all of the U.S. surge brigades, an additional U.S. brigade combat team, and thousands of non-U.S. coalition personnel, with further reductions ongoing. I'd like to explore for a few minutes what led to such progress. The popular understanding is that it was the surge, commonly seen as the U.S. sending 30,000 or so more combat troops into Iraq. In truth, the surge was much more than that, and should be understood more broadly as not just the commitment of more troops, but as the accompanying surge in employment of counterinsurgency principles as well. This is not to discount the importance of sending additional troopers, especially such magnificent ones as we have here in this auditorium with us today. At the low point of the security situation in Iraq, we were seeing more than 50 dead bodies a night turn up on the streets of Baghdad alone. So there was no doubt that more troopers were needed to help quell the horrific violence. Just as importantly, though, the commitment of additional forces signaled to the Iraqi people the United States' commitment to seeing Iraq through the crisis, in many cases giving Iraqis the confidence to eventually stand up to the extremists themselves. This signal of commitment and the resulting confidence our forces generated were key ingredients in producing the Sahwa, or awakening movements, that so benefited the security situation in Iraq in 2007. Another key ingredient of the surge was the accompanying Iraqi surge. Well over 100,000 additional soldiers and police were added to the ranks of the Iraqi security forces in 2007, ranks that now number over 600,000 in total. Additionally, over 100,000 local citizens joined the Sons of Iraq program, which employed local Iraqis to help keep their communities secure until Iraqi army and police elements were available to maintain security in the area. Together, these efforts provided the strength in numbers necessary to confront the elements that stoked the violence and brought Baghdad to its knees. Perhaps the most important element of the surge, though, was the focus on ensuring our soldiers were employed in line with key counterinsurgency concepts. For example, as the surge commenced, coalition and Iraqi forces began to focus first and foremost on securing and serving the population. We deployed our troopers, together with Iraqi security force personnel, to joint security stations and patrol bases located in the Iraqi neighborhoods, where they lived among, protected, and served the locals whose trust they sought to earn and did earn over time. The hard-won trust that results from living with the people proved critical in improving security. As local citizens, reassured that security forces were in their neighborhoods to stay, increasingly alerted troopers to malign activity and led them to weapons caches and enemy safe houses. As coalition and Iraqi forces began to provide breathing space from the violence, emboldened Iraqis increasingly began to reject violence and those who employed it. This led to and reinforced the implementation of another key counterinsurgency concept, the fostering of reconciliation. Efforts on the reconciliation front were many and varied. coalition and Iraqi commanders, for example, facilitated local meetings to bring together rival leaders newly willing to work in partnership for their communities. And by the way, few did it better or as well, in fact, as the great Colonel Rick Gibbs and his brigade in southern Baghdad. Also, U.S. and Iraqi elements worked together to reach out to individuals, from insurgents to Sadrists, who had opposed the Iraqi government, encouraging them to participate in the political process, offering amnesty programs, and providing skills training to disenfranchised military-age males. We also implemented counterinsurgency concepts inside the wire at our detention facilities, identifying the irreconcilable hardcore detainees and separating them from the rest of the detainee population, and providing job training, civic education, and basic skills training to the rest. All of these initiatives proved important to efforts to knit Iraqi communities back together and to build support for the Iraqi government. Another counterinsurgency concept on which we focused was the need for our operations to be comprehensive. The struggle in Iraq, and indeed in any counterinsurgency campaign, is ultimately about the legitimacy of the government. The Iraqi people, at the end of the day, were the decisive terrain, and their support for their government was essential. Thus, the increased security enabled by the surge and the concepts we implemented had to lead to the governance and economic improvements that made the Iraqi government legitimate in the eyes of its people. We thus partnered with Iraqi officials to help make this the case. Electricity generation, oil production, and commercial development investment were all increased significantly. And further job training, microloan programs, and job creation initiatives are underway, even as the bulk of those tasks are transitioned to Iraqi institutions. And over time, in fact, the Iraqi government has even enacted major legislation on contentious issues, increased its managerial capacity and budget execution, and conducted important elections. By pairing additional U.S. and Iraqi forces with the employment of counterinsurgency principles, secure and serve the population, foster reconciliation, employ a comprehensive approach, we helped achieve important progress in Iraq. And as President Obama recently announced, this progress will enable us to carry out the tasks agreed to in the U.S.-Iraqi security agreement. As he also noted, however, we will have to keep our eye on several looming challenges. These include upcoming national elections at the end of the year, resilient Sunni and Shia extremists malign external influences, lingering ethno-sectarian mistrust, increasing budget pressures, still inadequate levels of basic services, the release of over 10,000 Iraqi detainees, the anticipated return of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis displaced by the sectarian violence, and unresolved internal boundary disputes. As President Obama stated, and I quote, "There is renewed cause for hope in Iraq, but that hope rests upon an emerging foundation." We are, of course, helping Iraq strengthen that foundation. Again, Iraq is in a much better state than it was in early 2007, and a number of those in this audience should be rightly proud of the roles they played in tough situations there to achieve the progress that we now see. Turning to Afghanistan, we see a situation in marked contrast to that in Iraq. The trend has, frankly, been a downward spiral in many areas of the country. The insurgency in Afghanistan has expanded its strength and influence, and levels of violence in some areas in 2008 were double those in 2007. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and associated syndicate of extremists have demonstrated considerable resilience, due in part to the presence of safe havens just across the Afghan border with Pakistan, and in part to the steady flow of revenues from illegal narcotics trafficking and donations from outside Afghanistan. The resurgence of these groups has also resulted, to varying degrees throughout the country, from frustration with the slow development of Afghanistan's fledgling government, whose legitimacy has suffered due to the security situation, an inability to provide adequate essential services for the people, and corruption. Our fundamental objective in Afghanistan remains, as the President recently explained, to ensure that transnational terrorists are not able to establish the sanctuaries they enjoyed there prior to 9/11. Accomplishing this aim, though, requires not just killing or capturing terrorists, but also developing Afghan security forces, reducing the drug trade that finances the insurgency, fostering the growth of Afghan governance so that it can achieve legitimacy in the eyes of the people, creating basic economic opportunity for Afghan citizens, and so forth. Essentially, achieving our objectives in Afghanistan requires a robust, sustained, and comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign, which is, of course, what President Obama described last month when he laid out the new strategy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Given this situation, we have an opportunity to apply the lessons we've learned conducting a complex counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq to our efforts in Afghanistan, while noting that lessons learned in one operation have to be applied with great care in another. In fact, if there is any overriding principle of counterinsurgency, it is that context matters. What worked in one community in Iraq, in fact, may not have worked in the neighboring community or even 1 month later in the same location. And so we certainly cannot perform a wholesale transplant of successful practices from Iraq and expect them to work in Afghanistan. Indeed, the challenges in Afghanistan are in some ways more daunting than those in Iraq. Afghanistan is, after all, larger and more rural than Iraq and has much more rugged terrain and a harsher climate. Afghanistan has considerably less human capital and far lower literacy rates than Iraq, and it has less natural resources as well. By comparison, total revenue generation in Afghanistan last year was under $1 billion, compared to the nearly $60 billion in oil revenue alone generated in Iraq. And Afghanistan has very little infrastructure by which the government can deliver basic essential services. In Afghanistan, we are building, not rebuilding. Therefore, while the principles of counterinsurgency remain valid, these principles nevertheless have to be adapted to the unique cultural, political, geographic, and human terrain of Afghanistan. Well, this is the point in such a presentation at which the speaker should look around and check to see if the audience is still focused, shall we say. And the best way to ensure focus sometimes is to tell another quick story. And this one is especially pertinent as it relates to a recently declassified operation conducted as part of the struggle against extremism, a struggle in which, of course, CENTCOM has obviously been very involved. But this operation was conducted on an unnamed island in the Pacific Ocean. As the story goes, an infantry battalion was deployed to the desert island to conduct several missions, and they found they had to hire some local inhabitants as scouts and translators. It turned out, however, that the locals were cannibals, so the commander, who had completed all of his pre-deployment language and cultural awareness training, now part of preparation for deployment at the Command and General Staff College, made a point of speaking to the cannibals before the contract was finalized, in their language, in fact. "You're part of our team now," he told the cannibals. "One team, one fight, make way together, team of teams, all that good stuff. We'll pay you well for your services and we'll allow you to eat any of our rations. But please," he said, "please don't eat any of our soldiers." Well, the cannibals responded in a very reassuring manner, promising not to eat any of the troopers on the islands, and they shook hands with the commander and went to work. Everything was going smoothly until about 4 weeks later, when the commander called the cannibals together for a meeting once again. "You're all working very hard, and I'm very satisfied with your performance," he said. "However, one of our sergeants has disappeared. Do any of you know what happened to him?" The cannibals all shook their heads no and professed to have no idea of the missing sergeant's whereabouts. After the commander left, however, the leader of the cannibals turned to the others and asked sternly, "Which one of you idiots ate the sergeant?" Well, the cannibals all hung their heads and looked down, and finally one of them meekly put his hand in the air and said, "I did." "You fool," the head cannibal shouted. "For 4 weeks we've been eating lieutenants, captains, and even majors, and no one noticed anything." And then you had to go and eat a sergeant. Now, you notice, Todd. I didn't say anything about generals. I'm sure their absence would have been noticed immediately. Probably only by their aides, but that's beside the point. Well, now that I hope we've got everyone refocused, move back to the serious stuff, and serious it is indeed. Counterinsurgency principles for Afghanistan. As was the case in Iraq, additional forces are needed in Afghanistan. More are on the way in this regard, as President Obama recently announced plans to deploy additional troops to Afghanistan, and some NATO and coalition nations have pledged more trainers and forces as well. Having more forces on the ground will enable our troopers and those of our Afghan partners to hold more effectively areas that have been cleared in order to facilitate follow-on economic and governance improvements. And having more trainers on the ground will accelerate the continued development of Afghan national security forces. Sustained, substantial commitment from the U.S. and the international community will be necessary to forge progress in Afghanistan, and these additional commitments are important steps forward. As in Iraq, the resource requirement in Afghanistan is not just for additional coalition military forces, but also for more and improved Afghan security forces. Indeed, this is an important part of the new strategy announced last month, which calls for a focus on expanding and professionalizing the Afghan security forces. Efforts are also underway to involve local citizens in securing their communities through the Afghan Public Protection Program. Together, this will all help to provide the strength and numbers necessary to halt the downward spiral of violence in Afghanistan. Just more forces will not be enough, however, because, again, as in Iraq, it is how forces are employed that matters as much, if not more, than the fact that there are additional forces. Operating in a country known as the graveyard of empires, our forces must partner with their Iraqi counterparts to show the Afghan people that they are not would-be conquerors, but are instead there to secure and serve Afghan communities. Doing so will require being good neighbors, and while it may be less culturally acceptable to live among the people in certain parts of Afghanistan than it was in Iraq, it is nonetheless necessary to locate Afghan and ISAF forces where they can establish a persistent security presence and can come to know the dynamics and intricacies of local governmental, religious, and tribal structures. Fostering reconciliation will be another important counterinsurgency principle employed in Afghanistan. There has been some debate surrounding this issue, as many Afghan and U.S. leaders believe that a high-level reconciliation effort would require Taliban leaders to agree to preconditions that they would never be willing to consider. This may well be the case, but it does not prevent reconciliation from taking place at the local level, where local commanders and leaders sufficiently familiar with local dynamics can identify reconcilable elements of the insurgency and provide social and economic alternatives to them in order to win them over to the new Afghanistan. Finally, the insurgency and security situation in Afghanistan require a truly comprehensive approach, one that addresses the root causes and underlying factors that make certain areas fertile fields for the insurgency. An important element of a comprehensive approach is civilian capacity. Given that the greatest long-term challenge in Afghanistan is the need for economic and governance development, we need to augment the civilian expertise in Afghanistan as well. And this also is part of the new strategy President Obama announced last month, which calls for more fully resourcing the civilian aspects of our mission and significantly increasing the development mission. As always, military action is necessary but not sufficient. Additional civilian resources will be essential to building on the progress that our troopers and their Afghan partners can achieve on the ground. Another important element of our comprehensive approach in Afghanistan is understanding and approaching Afghanistan and Pakistan as a single problem set, as a single theater with different rules of engagement on either side of the Afghan-Pakistan border. This, too, is an approach endorsed in the new strategy. The militants and extremists operating out of Pakistan's tribal areas pose a threat to Afghanistan, as well as a serious regional and even global threat. Thus, even as we actively pursue militants and seek economic and governance improvements in Afghanistan, we also have to encourage the Pakistani government to recognize that these militants are the most significant threat to their country's very existence. Indeed, in support of our Pakistani counterparts, we are also working to help them increase the capability and capacity of Pakistani forces to conduct counterinsurgency operations, providing training and equipment that can help enable the cultural shift and institutional change required to produce a force capable of addressing the extremist elements in the federally administered tribal areas, Northwest Frontier Province, and other areas of Pakistan under threat. Returning to Afghanistan, an important focus as we pursue a comprehensive approach in that country is achieving greater unity of effort between the various elements of our operations. In view of that imperative, we're working hard to ensure that civil and military efforts are synchronized and complementary. This Saturday, in fact, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I will host an all-day offsite with U.S. civil and military leaders engaged in operations in Afghanistan to address issues in which additional civil-military coordination is necessary. Moreover, work is ongoing in Kabul and in Islamabad on development of joint civil-military campaign plans similar to the one that Ambassador Crocker and I developed in Baghdad. By increasing our civilian and military footprints in Afghanistan, focusing our troopers on securing and serving the population, fostering reconciliation, pursuing a comprehensive approach, and working toward greater unity of effort, we can help Afghan forces and leaders achieve the security, economic, and governance improvements that are so necessary in their country. The increase in forces and focus on securing the people are needed to help create the breathing space that will allow Afghans to stand up for themselves, and that will also allow the government to begin working for its people and providing essential services instead of simply struggling to survive. With improved essential services and better overall performance, the Afghan government will gain legitimacy. As this takes place, opportunities for reconciliation will become possible. As that takes place, intelligence inevitably improves. As intelligence improves, security operations become more precise and effective, and because of all that, security improves further. Each factor reinforces the other, and over time and with sustained commitment, progress in each can reverse the current trend in certain areas of Afghanistan and produce an upward spiral rather than the current downward one. Well, having described the situations in Iraq and Afghanistan and the way forward in each, let me conclude by noting what a tremendous job our men and women in uniform are doing in implementing America's policies in these two countries and throughout the Central Command region, where more than 215,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen are hard at work. We've asked a great deal of those in uniform in recent years. Our troopers have selflessly performed complex missions under tough conditions in very challenging situations. And many of our military families have endured lengthy separations during repeated tours in combat. Through it all, our men and women in uniform and their families have been truly magnificent. Last July 4th, I had the honor of raising my right hand in Baghdad with 1,215 of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines as they re-enlisted in a combat zone for another tour of service. They did this knowing that they likely would be asked to deploy again during the term of their new enlistment. Needless to say, I cannot say enough about these and all our great young Americans in uniform. And there is no question in my mind that they deserve the description that Tom Brokaw offered after seeing them in action in Iraq, calling them America's new greatest generation. Beyond that, I can assure you that there is no greater privilege than serving with the members of the new greatest generation as they strive to do what our country has asked of them. We should all be very proud of them and grateful for their courage, commitment, determination, and skill. They are our very best, and it has been an honor to describe their actions to you today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
A few questions?
Sure.
Good job. Well, General, that was a magnificent job. Thank you so much for updating us on what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq and many other troubled areas in the world. The General has very nicely agreed to answer some of your questions, and the way we've laid this out is that we have people out in the audience with mics with numbers like 1 through whatever. So what I will do is look up into the audience, and there's number 1 right there. And I don't know if you have a question. Should we start out with number 1? Does anybody have a question down there? How about, let's get your placards up there. There's number 4 up there, number 3, number 2. I know we really covered the waterfront here. He must have done one heck of a job. Okay, there is a question up there in the stadium, number 4. So, number 4, would you please ask your question? So we don't want any speeches, just questions.
So I can write down here.
Sir, thank you for attending. I'm Major Kelly. I'm a reserve officer. And the question I would like to ask is, how will we know or what kind of markers will there be that will show progress in Afghanistan other than just the military violence going down? What are some of the markers that we would be looking for as Afghanistan moves as Iraq has to a better situation?
Well, there will be a series of metrics or benchmarks. And in fact, interestingly, there is an effort ongoing right now to refine what's being developed in the interagency in Washington. And that effort is ongoing. It's a combination of folks from the intelligence community, of course, Department of Defense, folks over in the National Security Council staff, and then also on Capitol Hill. And I was explaining that to some members of Congress last week when we were testifying. But there's a number of different ways to see that as there are security steps forward, that those are being taken advantage of. And those that were in Iraq will recall, for example, one of the metrics of all things that we used to track down in the 4th Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division was shops in the Dora Market. And there will be a number of these kinds of things. And then you aggregate them over the country. Certainly progress of the Afghan security forces will be another important metric. Commercial activity, progress in the generation of electricity. Again, there are just a host of these, and in fact, we did have quite a substantial number that we focused on in Iraq, although frankly, at some points, we were focused on some pretty basic ones, such as can we put the electrical towers up again and have them stay up? So you have some very obvious ones in terms of the repair of various items of the infrastructure, and then your ability to just maintain it, keep it functioning, and keep it open. But again, that development effort of these benchmarks and so forth is actually ongoing, and I think they'll be determined and laid out for Congress probably sometime in early May, and then lock those down and literally start watching those. But that's not to imply that they don't already have these in Kabul. In fact, General McKiernan has a whole host of different metrics and PowerPoint slides, of course, being the military, that we track and use to measure how we're doing. And I think we'll go right here to number 3, please.
Yeah, number 3, right up there. Please.
Hello, General. Cadet Will Hoyt with K-State Army ROTC. My question is this. What role do you believe coin operations will play in the careers of roughly 4,500 soon-to-be commissionees here in May, as your son is about to be one of them? And do you believe it will weaken their ability to fight a future conventional fight?
Well, first of all, it's going to play a very significant role. And those who are being commissioned in May and we're proud to count our son among those, will indeed be involved in counterinsurgency operations. What I would remind you, though, is that counterinsurgency operations, like any military operation, are some mix of offense, defense, and stability and support operations. And I think that if you ask, for example, again, the 4th Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division, whether they can still do conventional operations, I think the answer would very much be yes. Now, they can do some other things as well, and it may be that they can't do some, they might not be able to do a box formation, brigade box formation moving across the desert if it comes to that, but I suspect that they could practice up on that and get that right in pretty short order. Clearly, when you focus more on stability and support operations, you're going to do less on the offense and defense, but that is not to imply at all that we cannot do offensive and defensive operations. And in fact, as the focus shifts to Afghanistan, I think you see over there, for example, extensive use of indirect fire and other components of traditional, conventional military operations. Although, again, you have to have the non-kinetic as well as the kinetic, and you have to work very hard to make sure that you get the mix right. And that's the real art of this, is determining what the components should be as you blend together offense, defense, and stability and support operations. But if you told for example, the troopers who fought the Battle of Sadr City in March and April of 2008 that they didn't know how to do conventional operations, I think you'd get a bit of a challenge. So it's more about the mix of these operations, and that's what I think we'll be focusing. We may shade it one way or another over time, both in our training and in our operations, but we're always going to do some of all of those different elements. Let's go to number, and what was this? Okay, right here, number 1.
I'm James Jorns, an alumni of Kansas State. Thank you very much for visiting. As the situation deteriorates in Pakistan, how secure do you feel the armament is, the nuclear armament there? And what do you think our role should and can be to help secure that?
Well, first of all, we are confident in the security of their nuclear weapons and their storage and handling of those. Beyond that, there is no question, if you open the aperture now beyond that particular component, that the threat posed by the extremists internal to Pakistan represents what most observers assess to be the most significant threat to the very existence of Pakistan, as opposed to the traditional threat, if you will, that the Pakistani military has focused on to the east with India. And in this case, this is another situation in which there has to, over time, be a transformation, not unlike the transformation that took place, by the way, about 3 or 4 years ago, as our own military services came to grips with how we should better prepare for and conduct operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's an enormous shift for the Pakistani military to transition from a focus that is almost exclusively on conventional military operations, in other words, offense and defense along their eastern boundary with India, to focus more on dealing with the irregular warfare threat posed by the internal extremists who have caused such alarm in recent weeks in particular, although I should note that there is a significant offensive operation underway in parts of the Northwest Frontier Province as of right now in Pakistan, and that there is a determination by the Pakistani military to roll back some of these advances by the Pakistani Taliban. Number 2.
General Petraeus, thank you for sharing with us. Really appreciate it. I'm a senior here from Overland Park, Kansas. My name's Ian. My question has 2 parts that are pretty much unrelated. First is, my dad lived in Afghanistan for several years when he was in high school, and ever since 9/11 expressed to me that he felt that the cultural challenges posed both in Afghanistan and Iraq would present a fight unlike anything we had seen as a nation. Obviously, as you've expressed, with operating within these cultural contexts in neighborhoods, establishing the trust, the reconciliation, all of these things, do you see this as something that has fundamentally altered the way that military will be both trained and operated in the future, or is this just a kind of regional context thing? And my second question was, is there any truth to the rumor that your nickname used to be Peaches?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no secret. When I was a kid playing Little League Baseball, and you got a name like Petraeus, nobody could pronounce that. And I sort of looked probably a little bit like a peach at those days. And I was the age of 8 or 9, came up to bat in the Little League game, and the announcer said, "Now at bat is David Peaches," and it stuck. And if you ask my classmates at West Point, which is about as far as it went, about me, they'll always respond with that. In fact, there's an interesting story because I grew up 7 miles from West Point. I went to West Point. Obviously very highly of West Point, married the superintendent's daughter. That's another story. It's a blind date. Honestly, a blind date. It was. You imagine being a cadet at West Point and you just find out that your blind date is the superintendent's daughter? And then we got married, and both our kids are baptized at West Point, so I have enormously strong feelings for West Point. But as I was there, a lot of the kids from my high school were employed at West Point for the summer, during which I was going through the plebe experience, as they call it, Beast Barracks, as it used to be called, before they I think it's now New Cadet Barracks or something more correct. But in any event, there we were in Beast Barracks, and all my old girlfriends were sending me messages through the laundry bag. And unfortunately, an upperclassman intercepted them, and it started out, "Dear Peaches." You can guess where that led. So there was a lot of merriment at my expense that afternoon. What about the cultural challenges? Well, they are enormous, and they do present considerable difficulties. And this is why I mentioned earlier that you have to change your mindset. The decisive terrain in these kinds of endeavors is the human terrain. Yes, mountains, high ground still matters, bridges still matter, crossing sites, all of that still matters. But again, the most important component, the decisive element, is the human terrain. And it is very different terrain from that which we know. In fact, I've argued over the years that what helped me perhaps more than anything else when I ended up in Iraq and looked back was civilian graduate school, of all things, and not just because it was some good learning, but because it was an out of my intellectual comfort zone experience. To go to a civilian grad school is to find out that, lo and behold, there are some awfully smart, incredibly bright and talented people who don't think the same way that those of us in the military tend to think. And that's a very salutary experience, because that's the same experience that the great troopers of the Black Lions, of course, found when they were there in West Rashid and southwest Baghdad. And if they hadn't been there before, they got a good dose of how do Iraqis, how do Arabs, Muslims, Sunni as well as Shia, think. And so understanding the cultural context, understanding the human terrain, having a truly nuanced and very granular, as we say, appreciation for the local circumstance and the local context and who's who and how is it supposed to work, how does it work, and all the rest of that is of paramount importance. And I think that that's an area in which our Army, all our military services have changed enormously over the years in focusing on that. Are you trying to tell me there's just one more, Mr. President?
That's it.
That's it. See that? Huh?
Let's try number 3 up here.
Where is number 3? Go ahead,
3,
please.
straight ahead.
Sure.
Again, thank you for coming. My question is a little off topic, but I do appreciate your honest and practical approach to a lot of the military challenges that we've faced in the last few years. I think that one of the most important considerations in the debate over whether the U.S. military should allow gays and lesbians to serve openly is whether it harms unit cohesion. Considering disruptive effects caused by the investigation and separation of soldiers from their units, the imperative that soldiers work together undeterred by personal likes or dislikes, and the practical application of the policy by which soldiers who are scheduled for deployment or are serving in combat theaters are less likely to be investigated or discharged, Do you think the current policy of don't ask, don't tell promotes or discourages unit cohesion?
Well, let me start off by saying that I've generally spent the bulk of my career going around minefields rather than walking right into them. And I think, frankly, that what I would do on that particular question is echo what Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen have said recently, and that is, frankly, that we have an awful lot on our plate in the military right now with 2 wars and a host of other challenges, and I'm not sure that we want to add something else to the plate at this moment. So with that, I think that's where I would actually come down on that particular issue and just stay with my secretary and my chairman if I could. Thank you.
Thanks. Great job. Great job. We've got a scripture here for you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, General, thank you for a brilliant Landon Lecture. And you covered the waterfront extraordinarily well. But it goes without saying that you have to accept this Kansas State University sweatshirt with your name and date, 153rd Landon Lecture, April 27th, 2009. So, ladies and gentlemen, here we go.
Much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So let's hold it up like this. Oh, and here's a, yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if the patrons could hold their seats and then everyone else can adjourn. Thank you very much for coming to this Landon Lecture, and we wish you the best. Go K-State. Thank you very much.